All right, so this is great. You're gonna love this. You can't make this stuff up. So, Mr. President, you just got out of a meeting with President Xi. Just walked out the door, hand still warm from the handshake. And it's a meeting that you sent all your people over there to try to facilitate because he didn't want to meet with you and begged on bended knee to try to get him. You sent Bill Gates, you sent Gavin Newsom, and finally he agreed to meet with you. And you just cleared the threshold of the door, Mr. President, and the whole purpose of the meeting is to try to get things out of the ditch and back on track with China to try to make relations, to smooth them over. Because the United States has been saber rattling and China's been doing a little bit of that. And it just, you got two conflicts already going on. Uh, One you started, and the other one seems like it might have snuck up on you. So you just left the meeting. So Mr. President, do you still think that President Xi is a dictator? Well, of course, they have a completely different system than we. uh, and the look on Anthony Blinken's face is just Secretary of State. He's just priceless. So, uh, live from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. So, during the recording of this video, early on, I hit the wrong button. And what it did is it replaced my live picture with a still of me. And so I'm not going to record it again. It's 45 minutes long. So I'm just going to leave it with the still, and hopefully you'll be fine with it. I'm going to have, some graphics as well to entertain you. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that. All right, so we got a lot of stuff to do to get through today. Okay, there we go. All right. This program is going to be more or less dedicated towards explaining why I feel the way I do or look at things the way that I do uh, because of the way that I grew up and the culture that I grew up in. Um, I was born here in the United States and grew up in the Upper South, and it probably comes as no shock to you if you're watching this video because of the means which I've gotten it out there that the liberal establishment, the Uniparty, has made a lot of enemies in this country and around the world. And this program is about how it made an enemy of me in particular. I, I'm not focusing on myself so much because that's of any particular significance, really. But I think there are a lot of people who had similar experiences to the ones that I did who can identify. And so you know who you are, if any of this makes sense to you. Now, the central premise of the Eurasian Century, this program, is that the Eurasian Alliance, the Chinese Russian alliance, stands poised to replace the United States as a global hegemon. Global hegemon is like the superpower, a king power kind of. And I'm not saying that this alliance, the Eurasian alliance, is going to rule the world like the Roman Empire. Uh, I think it's going to be more like a leadership role in terms of um, the economic web across the world and the security web across the world. Um, Part of this includes the assumption that nature abhors a vacuum and that it is impossible to replace something, U.S. Western leadership, with nothing. Uh, or what people are talking about as some amorphous entity called multipolarity. Um, that sounds nice, and in theory, that may be what we're moving towards, and that may be the best way of portraying it in the West, so as not to cause alarm. But um, I don't I don't think that you displace the King of the Hill with a committee. I don't believe that actually a worldwide committee. I don't think that'll work. I think you're going to have some other power that takes up the room that is being slowly vacated by the United States. Um, Now, I expect that the Russian Chinese alliance will kind of lead or direct the world with a lot less of a domineering attitude than the West has, and they would exert power primarily by economic rather than military means. Um, but nonetheless, the paradigm shift from Western to Eastern dominance is the central thesis of this channel. Um, Now, in this particular program, I hope to answer the obvious question: why would a citizen and resident of the West welcome or invite such a thing to transpire? Or more directly, what turned you against America? Now, I don't mean in the absolute sense. I wouldn't fight against America. Um, what I'm what I've turned against is the ideology that encompasses both parties here. In fact, the entire liberal ideology that animates American politics. Um, and I just think it's lasted long enough. um, I'll set aside the fact that I remain a Slavic Southerner and consider this primarily a Yankee problem. But nonetheless, what America has become on the whole is toxic. Um, Now, if you happen to live in a red state and you're well intertwined with your family and you have, you know, a life, say, in a small town, and it is pretty much the same way it's always been, except for some unfortunate cultural rumbles that you'll notice, then it may not seem so toxic. But I'm about to explain why I think it is terribly toxic. The answer to this question really has to be autobiographic because it shows how things have degenerated over. I just turned 56 over my lifetime. Um, you don't just wake up one day and turn on your own culture. It takes trauma, and my purpose is not to share that trauma as a personal expression, but to share it as a form of mutual empathy and bonding with some cross section of the viewership here. Um, Now, long ago, there was a fall from paradise. I think this is the best way to do it, an analogy like this. Once the world was perfect, death, suffering, and decay had no place in it. The world gave way, that world gave way to the one in which we were all born, which is a world of death, suffering, and decay. I'm not saying it's all negative, far from it. I mean, there's lots of positive. But as well as a world in which fear and guilt naturally rule the hearts of men without some sense of transcendence or salvation from above. Uh, I'm going to call that the first fall, the fall of man, which we're all familiar with. either from church or if you're Jewish from synagogue, or I'm sure in Islam has uh, some idea about that as well. Um, and familiar from the culture if you're not particularly religious. But there's also a second fall, and this is not doctrinal or dogmatic. It has nothing to do with Orthodox Christianity. It's just a paradigm that I'm proposing to understand this. Um, this is the fall from the natural form of human culture, the patriarchy, into an unnatural form of culture, which we will call gynocentric. I don't use the term matriarchy because that term is problematic, um, in as much as matrilineal descent is not the norm um, here in Western culture. Uh, Women are, nor are women and mothers the guardians of everyone in the household. They may be the guardians of the children if it's a um, single parent family, but they are not responsible for the men in the same way that men used to be responsible for women. However, the patriarchy, the form of culture in which fathers and men rule or dominate, um, not in a negative fashion, but in a nonetheless in a hierarchical fashion, has been legally abolished, and that has had a monumental effect on the society, the culture, the psyches of American and Western humanity, specifically on the psyches of males, and this is a profoundly negative effect. I recall having some conception of the nuclear family, with the father as the head in my childhood, early childhood. This is more than many people younger than I experienced. I was born in 1967 in the Upper South, one of the latter parts of the country to transform as a result of the changes that characterized the 1960s and 1970s. But I was also raised by a single mother after my parents' divorce when I was 3 years old. Much of my childhood, we lived with my grandparents who lived a more traditional family pattern before me. I thank God for that because otherwise I would have no conception of normal other than what I had read about in books. Because divorce became a spectator sport at some point in the culture, and so I mean, most of the people that there are a few whose parents didn't get divorced, and a few that I knew in school who haven't experienced divorce themselves, but it's normal anymore. Um, and so if that statement, that I wouldn't have any conception of normal, but for that seems Orwellian to you, um, like something you might hear from somebody raised in Soviet society or during Mao's Cultural Revolution. Well, that in fact was the reality. Um, we may not appreciate it that much today because we don't have that feeling of um, the old patriarchal culture that existed as long as anyone remembers. Um, that feeling is gone, and we're are least inclined to notice a dystopian revolution. Dystopian means screwed up, you know, a place that's screwed up. Um, we're least likely to notice a dystopian revolution when it's perpetrated non-violently by social osmosis. It's like boiling frogs. You turn up the heat slowly, and they don't notice that the heat's getting hotter. It's that the temperature's getting hotter until it's too late and they can't climb out. And so I was raised on cultural phenomenon like Free to Be You and Me. Um, and the TV show, there was an album with Marlo Thomas and Alan Alda for kids. Um, that had the kind of liberal progressive idea of what growing up or being a child should be like. Um, One Day at a Time, the TV show about the single mother, Maud, TV show about a rather strong personality of a feminist character with B. Arthur. Those were the cultural phenomenon that I grew up in. And these influences, and there are lots of others. Three's Company is another one. MASH with another one with Alan Alda. All in the Family, where Archie was always the one who was behind the times and retro, and Rob Reiner's character was always the one that was cutting edge, progressive, and until he left his own family later on in that series world. But in any case, these influences rewrote the script for male characters in society, replacing the patriarchy with something else, something more touchy feely, and yes, more feminine and more feminist. Thus, many young men of my age, including me, had no real sense of what it meant to be a man upon reaching the age of majority. I freely confess that. The best society could come up with was, and I remember this fairly clearly, Iron John. Um, the spirit of the wild, wise man, concocted as an attempt at an innocuous, non sexist masculinity. At best, Iron John is just a boy playing wild in a fantasy with no connection to the reality in which the author found himself. It was kind of a feeble attempt at trying to rescue some modicum of masculinity in this morass of dystopian feminism, I guess. Masculinity cannot be recovered by fairy tales, but by actively challenging the rules of the prevailing feminist gynocentric order. People wonder why you have adolescent male mass shooters. Something in their psyches presses them to directly challenge the dystopia in which they find themselves, with a ferocity proportionate to the degree of alienation that they feel. Um, Again, I'm not encouraging anyone towards violence. I'm just trying to explain what I think is the psychological basis of some of this stuff. Um, it was relentless. There were action heroes, but these weren't really to be emulated in reality, but they were more like supernatural entertainment mythology. Superman, Batman, Schwarzenegger's Commando. You couldn't be like that. It is entertaining, and it may have gotten your androgens fired up a little bit, but it's not anything that socializes you as a man. Even in this genre, we got William Catt in The Greatest American Hero. I think the touchy feely, mm, liberated to be a feminist superhero. Um, this actually caused a wave of crises and mental health issues, emotional health issues, along the same lines as you would expect. Were a thoroughly domesticated animal knowing nothing else his whole life or released into the wild. Um, a whole generation of men and the generations probably subsequent because the culture hasn't let up are like that. They, if you take an animal that's used to being feral in its own environment with other animals like it, and you domesticate it, you can't really humanely release it back into the wild because it has no conception of what's out there, and that is a parallel somewhat to what my generation of males experienced and had to deal with. Now, there are other ways of getting around that. I mean, some guys delved heavily into, well, some ended up in the military. Um, some had strong fathers. Um, Divorce wasn't ubiquitous, um, but it was rampant. And many of us were raised by single mothers, and to say the least, found the prospect of military service to be too structured an environment. Um, and so, effectively, um, this prevented us from uh, adult manhood. But society was changing. Society, in particular, our elders, changed more slowly than we did since they had not shared our problematic upbringing. And so at first, we were strangers in a strange land. Some of us overcame it very quickly um, because, even if you're a domesticated animal and you're thrown in with other wild animals, um, if you're smart, and, we're smarter than wild animals, hopefully, um, you can actually make the adjustments if you focus on it and try. Some of us overcame it quickly, some did not. All the while, those of us who were educated had the benefit, of course, of knowing on an intellectual level that our age, the age in which we lived, was a cutting edge, unique era, and that most of human history up to this time, um, up to the time that we arrived, was patriarchal. And we could see this from the literary and historical record. And so this is a part that is difficult to talk about, but I think it's important, and it's the place that I would hope to connect with the viewers who had a similar experience. Um, we never felt that we were entitled to the patriarchal role in society, to be the alpha male. We weren't allowed. It was bad, selfish, even criminal to manifest masculinity in that way. It was a moral decision made for us. It's difficult to talk about because the result was that something was taken from us. We were robbed. Um, Now, I'm not playing the violin as, oh, poor, pitiful me. Obviously, I've overcome this whole um, complex, I suppose you would call it. But I'm trying to explain my views as far as worldviews, mindsets, and why I feel about liberal culture the way I do. We were robbed of what our fathers and their fathers and their fathers, going back to time immemorial, enjoyed as their natural right as being men. And we can never get those years or experience back. And that is a source, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, of fierce hatred for those of us who understand this fact. Um, Now, you can deal with that in several different ways. Um, the way I choose to deal with it is to make sure it stays cold, that the fierce hatred is cold. You can call on it wherever you need to, but it doesn't animate you as a passion. Um, for those of you who are not familiar with classical Christianity, passions are overwhelming emotions. It's when you don't enjoy the emotion drives you. You may enjoy it, but you're not in control of it. And so we try to avoid those in my faith. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with having experienced and being able to call on that fierce hostility, we'll call it. But you can't live there, and you can't just take it with you because it can destroy you. Um, but it's nice to have it in the refrigerator whenever you need it. And you're always going to remember it's there and it's going to come back because you can't change your experience. Um, Now, it takes a monumental effort to acquire any true sense of absolute confidence, alpha quality. If it's been um, forbidden from you, or you've been deprived of the experience of even such thoughts because of the environment in which you find yourself. These are um, things that just the socialization and the daily interaction always mark as taboo for us, except in entertainment uh, as fantasy. This was all our lives, even to the present day in this culture. Look how men are currently portrayed in sitcoms, romantic comedies, especially fathers. Castrati, one and all. Um, there are exceptions, but most of the exceptions are in action movies, and these are again pure fantasy, something to which we're not entitled to actually act out. And even there, in recent decades, female characters have moved up to equal status with the supposedly alpha males. So consider the strength of the cultural force which has caused men of a certain class to cross their legs like women when they sit. Um, Effeminate is affluent. It is considered civilizing and civilized. And so naturally, LGBT is in fashion. It is ideological castration, preserving the male element only to enable reproduction at a ridiculously low fertility rate. Um, Among whites, I think it's 1.75. Among blacks, it's 1.8. That's well below the replacement rate. And that's, it's preserved to mainly perpetuate sexual satisfaction. Um, it seems like the culture as a whole has given up on the idea of maintaining a replacement rate. The idea is to import people from uh, more patriarchal cultures and to solve the problem that way. It must be very different to grow up in a Muslim society or even a more traditional Christian society like some of the stands, like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. In any case, the culprit that caused this spiritual emasculation was Western liberalism, liberalism itself, an ideology that sprang from the Enlightenment that is at war with traditional religions and worldviews around the world. And it believes it has a right to overcome all of them and essentially replace them in any matters of substance. And so the prospect that Western liberalism, which encompasses the entire spectrum of U.S. politics, you have progressive liberals, you have centrist liberals, and you have conservative liberals, but they're all liberals. The prospect of that being displaced as the primary culture in the world, in our world and the rest of the world, is a delicious prospect for people like me. It cannot change the past. It can't do much for us personally, having already lived most of our lives. However, there's a certain satisfaction and justice involved which might renew and fortify our faith in providence for those who have called that into question. Um, like I said, I've gotten past most of this stuff myself personally already, but I understand what does Bill Clinton said? I feel your pain, and that's what this program is about. But this liberalism is not only emasculating in its feminism and gynocentrism, that's bad enough and at the center of the Western sickness. I believe that's the fundamental problem. But multiculturalism, um, that is, white guilt and white self hatred, anti racism, and replacement theory, and all that stuff, is another facet of it. Man mankind is naturally not only patriarchal but ethnocentric. I'm not advocating violence against anyone. I'm not advocating hostility towards any group based on ethnicity or anything like that. But we are naturally ethnocentric. We like our own culture, and that's what the pond we prefer to swim in. Lastly, the normalization of non-heterosexual lifestyles is another core component. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Notice all of these priorities: gynocentrism, multiculturalism, and homosexuality all militate against the fertility rate of the dominant culture in the West. That is, the whole endeavor of liberalism is fundamentally self destructive. For this, we may thank God. I mean, at least there's a backstop to all of it. Now, this is an important note. Don't think that I'm blaming women for the dystopia in which we find ourselves. I'm blaming liberals in general and feminists in particular, but those labels can be applied to either men or women. Um, that includes a cross section of both. Consider that it was men who passed the married women's property laws of the late 19th century. It was men who voted to extend the franchise to women in the 1920s. It was also a Supreme Court composed of men who decided Roe versus Wade and some of the other early feminist decisions. Now, there was also a movement of suffragettes and later women's liberation. Women certainly had agency in the changes that we've experienced, but it was largely accomplished at the legislative and judicial level by men. Um, and just as an aside, it had a lot to do with the market, with business culture. Um, it it really came into fashion after World War II, well, during World War II and after, because at that point, American business figured out that it could be much more productive if it had both men and women in the workforce because women were in their workforce during the war because men were off fighting the war. So, um, whatever's good for business must be good for America. Uh, anyway, we men did it to ourselves. Predominantly male legislatures and courts created the current system of no fault divorce, postmarital redistribution, that facilitates the feminist gynocentric revolution. Conversely, there are many women who have avoided most of the excesses of these developments, have managed to marry, excel as homemakers, as well as sometimes outside the home, bear and rear children in a more or less traditional paradigm. In fact, the whole tradwife phenomenon is fascinating, even in the mere fact that it exists. There are subcultures, Mormon, some Eastern Orthodox, Amish, uh, which have never strayed from this model, but it's interesting to see it reappearing in a culture that abandoned it some time ago. The thing that is really intriguing about it is how contemporary society reacts to the trend. The attitude seems to be, how could a woman possibly settle for this? Given the fertility rates of non-Hispanic women in the United States and of native European women, eventually um, the only wives here and in Europe will be trad wives, and there will be a lot less non-Hispanic Americans and native Europeans if current trends continue. It's not about who's right, but rather about who's left. And now I want to review a little bit and talk, uh, offer kind of a model to understand what's happening in the world because we have all kinds of political changes that stem from this war of liberalism against the rest of the world and even against more traditionalist, nationalist elements in the United States. Um, so I want to look back at the paradigm that we initially set up in the first program I did, the war between the West and the rest, between the globalists and nationalists. Liberalism is the heart of all the conflicts we see, or most all the conflicts that we see in progress or on the horizon. Uh, like, for example, in Taiwan or Serbia in the Balkans. The conflict in Ukraine is liberalism versus Christianity. The conflict in Israel is liberalism versus Islam. The potential conflict in Taiwan, liberalism versus Confucianism or Chinese nationalism. And again, the potential conflict in the Balkans is Islam and liberalism versus Christianity. These three worldviews, liberalism, Christianity, and Islam, obviously have a difficult time getting along together. This is no surprise in that they are mutually exclusive states of mind. It seems as if liberalism is the most aggressive of these at present, but this betrays the fact that it is also the most unstable, vulnerable, and dwindling. An animal that's cornered is the most aggressive, likely to lash out. Orthodox Christianity is having a revival in Russia, Hinduism in India. The Islamic revival got going 40 years ago, over 40 years ago. It was 1979 when Ruhollah Khomeini returned from Paris to Iran and the Shah fled. And bear in mind that the Islamic revival started in Shiite Iran. Neo-Confucianism is the de facto operating system of People's Republic. Their communism is with Chinese characteristics. And they're so enamored with private productivity that it's really a misnomer to call it communism anymore. Even a sort of traditionalist nationalist Roman Catholicism has revived in Hungary and Poland, and possibly is emerging in Latin America. So the traditional faiths are getting stronger, and the last ideology of the Enlightenment, liberalism, is fading, and quickly. Russia has prevailed in Ukraine. It's a done deal, just has to play out. It's too early to know how the war in Israel will conclude. Like in Ukraine, we can see the way that Taiwan is likely to play out. I think China will prevail. The real question in the Chinese Taiwan U.S. Potential conflict is what's going to happen in the Chinese elections in January if the Kuomintang is going to return to power, because they're much more enamored of reunification with Beijing. But you can see from the conflicts we already have that the war against liberalism is raging apace. It is said, "Never kick a man while he's down." To which a good friend of mine replied, "Why not? Seems to be the best time to kick him." As the world perceives weakness in America and the West, individual countries and blocs, the instincts of these individual countries and blocs to increase and expand their power, that's kicked in. Russia was first with its active resistance in the Ukraine. Others, now that it's won effectively, others are inevitably going to pile on. Hamas was just the first. We can expect more trouble in various locations, including the Balkans and Africa. So how do we make sense of all this mess? I'm going to put a graphic up called Levels of Awareness. And this is to kind of show how I divided up, in my mind, all the political uh, intrigue and shenanigans and whatever that we deal with looking at geopolitical matters, geostrategic matters. The first lowest level is parochial. Um, we're just looking at America and the old paradigm between Republicans and Democrats, Coke or Pepsi, basically. Because if nothing else, the whole drama with former President Trump woke a lot of people up to the fact of the uniparty and that it's really one thing. Um, then a level above that, I would call the nationalist or Amerocentric for us in America. America is the midst of a conflict between the uniparty, the globalists, and traditional nationalists, MAGA. Um, I don't consider myself a part of MAGA, but um, I suppose if I'm going to root for one side to win, that would be MAGA, and one side to lose, that would be the uniparty globalists. Um, I don't think MAGA goes halfway far enough, but maybe it's a good start. I'm not sure how far it'll get. Um, then there's the international level, where you're not just looking at uh, your own little pond. Um, you see America or your own country as an integral part of international dynamics, and that includes the emerging dichotomy of Western globalists versus the Eurasianists in the global South. Um, that is the main dichotomy of international politics right now. That the camps, I suppose you would say. It used to be the American West and the Soviet Eastern Bloc. Now it's emerging into these two camps, the West and the rest. And there's another Cold War going on, except I don't think it's going to last as long as the the last Cold War, and I think it's going to be a hotter war than the last Cold War. Um, then there's what I call the phronemic um, level of awareness. And this is, you're not just talking about countries internationally, you're talking about what worlds they live in terms of their consciousness, their psyches, their psychological states, the worldviews. These, as I've said, include liberalism, the prevailing Western uh, worldview, Christianity, which prevails in Russia, and it's these liberalism expanded so far and so wide, largely due to the digital revolution, the media, that really what you see liberalism is a worldwide phenomenon, and what is happening is these other worldviews are reemerging, and at any given moment, they're a hybrid of Christianity and liberalism, Islam and liberalism, Confucianism and liberalism, and they're gradually losing their liberalism. Um, so, Hinduism in India is another one. These are the operating systems of the mind and the psyche that inculcate different sets of values, different virtues, and different ideas about morality. And those operating systems generate different political expressions, which sometimes agree with each other and sometimes are in conflict. But when people talk about our values um, in the West, usually they're talking about liberal values, the liberal um, operating system, worldview, mindset. Those four are where these programs are going to be mostly concerned with those four levels. Of course, there's a higher level, which we may touch on from time to time, which is the most important level, um, the spiritual level of the individual soul. Um, and this is a universal constant, and I won't get into that too much, but just know it's there and it bears on all these other levels as well. Now, this, of course, is just a model or a tool to sort out and understand everything that's going on the world stage. And the geostrategic analysis, which is what I call what I do, seems like a fancy word for the chess game, really. Um, it is, as I said, concerned with the first four of those. Um, but it's always worthwhile to keep in mind that this world is only an antechamber to the world to come.